Good morning, and welcome back, everybody, to this very bright morning. So the panel this morning is on language, translation, and circulation of science. Each speaker has 20 minutes to speak. The way that I will do this is when you have 2 minutes to go, I will hold on this, sign. And when your 20 minutes are up, the music will start playing and I will get up and do a jig. So, so that's where, you got to stop. Because the only way you're going to stop the bad jig is by stopping. If you don't, then I'll keep insulting you with the bad jig. So you don't want that. Okay. So without further ado, the first speaker is Vera Elisabeth Gerling. I hope I got that right.
Okay. Perfectly.
Okay, thank you. And she'll be speaking on translation as cultural transfer and discursive practice, self-translation in the work of Rosario, Ferré. Okay. And Vera Elisabeth Gerling is a graduate in literary translation from the Heinrich-Heine-University in Düsseldorf. Her doctoral dissertation was on the reception of Latin American narratives in German language anthologies. Don't let me murder the title of your book. In her habilitation, she devotes herself to a phenomenologically conceived concept of translation, Leben im Text, translational thinking as an epistemological paradigm. She teaches and researches in the fields of Spanish and French literary and cultural studies, as well as theory, practice, and history of literary translation. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you, Barbara Portas, Claudio Pinheiro, and Zina Kloss, who isn't here, for this invitation and to be here in presence with all of you. Very happy to be here. First of all, I would like to know who of you is speaking Spanish. I can't see now the... Oh, that's fine, very fine. So I don't know if you are aware how often translation has been a subject yet here in these 2 days of Congress. So we had Farid Alatas, who spoke about the role of translators in colonial contexts. We had Rūpāntara, who told us something about the emotions translated into movement. We had Rajiv Bhargava who speak between other things about translatability of concepts of religion. And even this morning during breakfast, we spoke about work about Tagore's translation in Brazil. So the notion of translation is, it seems to me, in a broader sense, often underlying our discussion. So I think it's very important to reflect the notion of translation. So translation as an epistemologic concept, and also the role of translation for knowledge production. So my aim today is to sensibilize for the translation process today. It's not a meta-reflection about funding possibilities in translation studies, but it's more about translation itself. So let me first consider some ideas about fundamentals of translation. Normally, translation is widely understood to be a more or less successful transfer between 2 languages. However, this is translation also means a kind of cultural transfer in the sense of, as Susan Besnett points out. So her work established in some way the cultural translation studies. It's not only about linguistic approaches to translate one text to another language, but it's also a transfer from one culture to another. Beatriz Sarlo also underlines that translation is always a process in which both languages and both cultures get altered. And for her, translation always entails a practice in difference. So I'm citing, translation is an exercise in difference, not just a search for linguistic or semantic equivalences. One's own language loses its exclusivity in translation. It gets into the situation of being exposed to other languages and other forms of thinking and being guarded, controlled, enriched and deformed by them. Processes of translation enable a form of conjunction and exchange that transcends the boundaries of cultures, eras, and spaces. This, however, does not happen without friction. It is rather a continual cultural negotiation. Part of translation is always also the intranslatable and failure. During this process, languages lose their exclusivity, other lines of thought come into play, and third spaces, sensu baba, may be created. Translation could therefore be considered a type of heterotopic writing, which has the potential to override the hegemonial of interpretation. Therefore, the act of translation also implies a political act. In addition, the act of translating text actually does not take place in a power vacuum, but is also part of and influenced by the literary field in the sense of Bourdieu. That means canon formation, institutionally requested prioritization, and the reception behavior of the readers. So translation does not happen in a vacuum, but in a continuum. It is not an isolated act. It is part of an ongoing process of intercultural transfer. Moreover, translation is a highly manipulative activity that involves all kinds of stages, this process of transfer across linguistic and cultural boundaries. Translation is not innocent. One can therefore speak of a kind of heterotopic writing in translation, or in multilingual writing. Language can produce other places beyond the norm. It can thus question normative notions of language, but also of identity and societies. Such heterotopic writing can also be found in Rosario Ferré's work. I'm showing you a citation. I wanted to switch, but just you can read if you want to. So Rosario Ferré is bilingual writer. She's moving between Spanish and English. Her bilingual writing, which in many cases implies self-translation, but in a very creative sense, can be considered a wandering between cultures. So the self-translation we are dealing with in the work of Rosario Ferré has little to do with classical notion of translation. Some experts defend the idea that bilingual authors automatically would be their best translators. Helena Tanqueiro, for example, argues that self-translators can never misinterpret because they are at home in both cultures and know their text particularly well. However, this assumption of an ideal translation situation is based on a rather simple presupposition of successful hermeneutics, which has actually been obsolete since Roland at the latest. So the academic study of self-translation since the 1970s has indeed been concerned with a wide range of forms of self-translation. According to Rosario Ferré herself, translation processes show that it's simply impossible to transcribe one cultural identity into another. So, and so for her, bilingual writing also shows the incompatibility of identities, even if they concern the same person. To be a bilingual writer doesn't mean just to be bilingual. A bilingual writer is really two different writers, has two different voices, writes in two different styles, and most important, looks at the world through two different sets of glasses. The poetic oeuvre of Rosario Ferré offers a unique perspective on these propositions, since her self-translations cause shifts that render unequivocal cultural assignments impossible. Let's first talk about Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory of the US under its sovereignty. Approximately 3.5 million people live on this archipelago of 3.5 square miles. 99% there speak Spanish, and 70% belong to the Catholic faith. Most of them are descendants of Spaniards, but also most of them are mestizos who emerged from the clash of Spaniards with the indigenous Taino and African slaves. It's also interesting that geographically it is part of North America. The economic situation is poor, and Puerto Rico has one of the highest rates of immigration in the world, mostly to the heartland of the US. So the musical West Side Story represents the best known example for an artistic approach to this subject. So this is a specific environment. Puerto Rico belongs to the USA, but is almost exclusively Spanish speaking, hence has two official languages, Spanish and English. Vargas Llanos, who analyzes the legal relationship between both states, argues how does Puerto Rico fit into the US federal system? Puerto Rico is not a constituent state of the United States. Rather, Puerto Rico is a territory, a colony of the United States. This tie of Puerto Rico to the United States is structured by the Treaty of Paris of 1898, which transferred sovereignty of Puerto Rico from Spain to the United States. You can go on reading, and there's also Jorge Duaney, a Puerto Rican anthropologist at Florida International University at Miami, that calls Puerto Rico a post-colonial colony. So let's see some facts about the author. So Rosario Ferré, her family history is yet inscribed in her surname and shows the complexity of colonial societies. She lived in Puerto Rico. Her French grandfather had gone to Puerto Rico for the construction of the Panama Canal. She has published numerous children's books, stories, and volumes of poetry in which the negotiation between cultures and language is one of the central subjects. This includes, in particular, this lyrical work called Language, Duelo de Lenguaje. In her first literary period, Ferré wrote only in Spanish, mainly short stories. She became a symbol of Puerto Rican struggle for identity and autonomy and against the possible annexation of the island to the US. In this context, it's interesting to know that her father, Luis A. Ferré, was the founder of the New Progressive Party defending the statehood. In 1995, Ferré began to write in English. Thus, writing in English as well has earned very many enemies. But it may also be seen as an appropriation of English language and therefore as an act of emancipation. Ferré herself has defended this vehemently, so you may read the English part. Ser puertorriqueño es un ser híbrido. Mitades son inseparables. No podemos prescindir de una sin sentirnos mutilados. No soy menos puertorriqueña porque puedo escribir en inglés. ¿Por qué tengo que limitarme a un solo idioma cuando puedo expresarme en dos? ¿Por qué utilizar una mano si tengo dos? Let's now see some examples of poems. So we have here two poems. One is Beso is not a kiss. A beso is like eating leeches on a mountain top. In a kiss, Cleopatra draws the asp to her breast. So as not to enter Rome and change. There are mysteries of the tongue that cannot be explained. And the Spanish version is un beso no es un kiss. La palabra beso es como una joya comiéndose una poma rosa en la cima de una montaña. Kiss trae consigo el silbido del áspid que Cleopatra acercó a su pecho cuando rehusó entrar a Roma encadenada. La lengua admite misterios inexplicables. So even if you don't know Spanish, you see that the Spanish version is longer than the English version. So there's a certain addition that we can consider. So in this case, beso and kiss are not the same and don't express the same. And these associations are more or less erotic or more or less disgusting, perhaps because we have the leeches and the Pomarosa, which are confronted with each other. So in the English version, the kiss is compared with eating leeches, and in the Spanish language poem, it's the word beso, which is compared to a young girl eating an exotic fruit. So the images created are quite different. And then we see that the word kiss also presented here in its onopoetic sound, but only in the Spanish version. And the sound leads us to the different connotation of the asp used by Cleopatra, so kisses of the asp. And also we have the polysemy of the words tongue and lengua, but each of it can be translated both by tongue and language. So it's interesting here. So this poem, do you hear me? Yes. So this poem is a practice in difference. because, as we see here, there are mysteries of the tongue that cannot be explained, as she herself says. So we have another example. In fact, I swear, de hecho yo les juro. In fact, I swear that as I talk to you in English about my right to speak in Spanish, I can hear the guns boom and see the cannonballs roll over my head. And we see the Spanish version. De hecho, yo les juro que mientras discuto en español sobre mi derecho de hablar inglés, escucho rugir los cañones y veo las bombas salir volando sobre mi cabeza. So here in both versions address the fact that the choice of language entails a high degree of conflict with the description of the bomb. For the description of the bomb stands for it. So the bombs symbolize the conflict of languages, which in turn stands for the difficult situation in the country of Puerto Rico. So it's the question of language choice, which is really tied to a constellation of power. So although the majority of the population is the country has 2 official languages. So you see that there's, when you see both poems, and it's a bilingual book, Duelo de Lenguaje, so you have like a chiasm showing that when she speaks in English, she speaks about her right to speak Spanish, and when she's speaking Spanish, she speaks about her right to speak English. So you see that's quite a creative mode of self-translation, so to say. And also we can see that these bombs we can be a metaphorical symbol for this difficult situation, but you can also read in this, perhaps if you want to, some real things like in 1937 there has been the Ponce massacre, so there's really 19 civilians and 2 policemen were killed and more than 200 civilians were wounded. Then in the 1950s, you have the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party revolt. So it's really a very lot of aggression in this conflict also. And the United States Navy used Vieques, which is a little island from Puerto Rico, as a maneuvering area and area for bomb tests from 1941 to 2003. So there are really bombs, also real bombs acting there and representing this conflict between languages and politics. So it is noticeable here that the standpoint taken by the lyrical eye, if we turn back to this, is complementary in the respective languages, as are told. So the point from where you are speaking is also influencing in what you are saying. And that's a very interesting and important fact, I think, about this poem. So this can also be, there's another last example. So, mientras más se prohíbe, más se empeña en este país en hablarlo. The more you habla español, the more Spanish wants to be the official language of this country. So here again, you see a very special way of self-translation. So, so here it's about the ban on speaking Spanish, which achieves the opposite. And the more you habla español, Spanish is personified and in its desire to become the official language. The bilingualism of the first verse itself realizes a hybrid constellation. It is noticeable here that the standpoint taken by the lyrical eye is complementary to in the respective language. The English language version, in the English language version, it is explicitly emphasized that English is spoken. And the right to speak Spanish is demanded and so on. So it's a bit like in the other poem we've seen. So there's no equivalence in this kind of self-translation. There's no fidelity in translation in this case, but that's why these poems show this critical situation of Puerto Rico. So it can also be read as a change in the balance of power, since here Spanish invades English in this poem. And the very fact that Ferré presents her work bilingually and that the texts in each language receive the value of an original, being an intertextual exchange with the respective other version can be read as a de-hierarchization of power relations, precisely because in this case Spanish is the original, it's on the left, and English the translation. So I'm coming to my conclusion. Thank you. Rosario Ferré's poetic work, Language Duel, Duelo de Lenguaje, aesthetically confronts a linguistic conflict, which simultaneously has a historical-political dimension. The bilinguality of her country is reflected in the consistent self-translation of her poems. She writes in Spanish and English. This bilingual work is initially perceived as a self-translation. Thus, one could assume that it depicts the bilingualism of Puerto Rico as a kind of natural form of its multilingual society. Bilingualism would then be understood as a hybrid but a harmonious coexistence of cultures and languages. So there's Gemma Soledad Castillo Garcia, for example, who comes to such a conclusion in her monograph on self-translation in Rosario Ferré from 2013. She pretends that Rosario Ferré is experimenting a kind of self-discovery journey to find a solution to the problems of identity, which are typical for Puerto Rico and for the mediation between cultures. This might be correct for the bilingual novels Castillo Garcia analyzes. And in this case, it could also be seen as a strategic to find a broader public. However, in the poems of the collection Language Duel, Duelo de Lenguaje, we don't find bilingual harmony, but friction, contradiction, and conflict. Duels between the two languages that represent the political conflict, even if the Spanish title has a double sense, duel also as grief or sorrow for language. So I would agree to what Simona, Coco, and Paola Mancosu state, and I'm citing, Ferré's rewriting reflects on the dynamics of power between languages and cultures, in particular between English and Spanish languages on the island of Puerto Rico. So for me, so Language Duel and Duelo de Lenguaje is a space for a bilingual discursive practice of friction and negotiation between the so-called global North and global South. So I would say that this poetics, that in the sense of Veit Alatas also, poetics itself should be considered as also a method for transcultural thinking. So poetics as a kind of scientific production also, and translation can be a subject for our context, keeping in mind that there are always power relations underlying translation processes of much kinds of what we are talking about here. So thank you.
Yes, our next speaker is Rindon Kundu, who is at present an assistant professor of English at Sri University in Kodak, but is also pursuing a PhD from the Department of Comparative Literature at Jadavpur University in Kolkata. He is the treasurer of the Comparative Literature Association of India and has been nominated as the South Asian Regional Director of the International Association for Echo Translation Research. In 2018, he was invited to give plenary presentation to the 6th International Symposium on Echo Translatology at Zhengzhou University in China. He has been awarded several international grants, like the IATIS 2018 Hong Kong Bursary by the International Association of Translation and Intercultural Studies, a full grant by the British Academy to participate in the African Translation and Interpreting Studies Writing Workshop held in South Africa in 2019, and the Young Researcher Travel Grant in 2019 by the European Society for Translation Studies. The talk this morning is on, should I try?
Yes.
Rūpāntara, Vivartanam, Tarjumā, Bhāṇgani, Chāyā, exploring alternative notions of translation from the global south.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I have added one more terms today morning, actually. A very good morning to the chair of the session, all the organizers and fellow participants present here on screen. And I'm thankful to Barbara, to Claudio, to Sina, and also Martina and Aline. Because of them, I'm standing here. I want to start my presentation with a disclaimer that this is my humble attempt towards thinking about possible ways to theorize translational activities in India and is a part of my doctoral project. I will therefore love to have your opinion on it because I'm still thinking aloud on the subject. The geographical region that has been termed as Global South has always been considered the receiving end of theory, with no exception in the field of translation studies. Like other translation studies, like other disciplines of social sciences and liberal arts, has treated the Eurocentric ideas as universal and thereby homogenized the differences by non-recognizing the non-European ideas. The aim of this paper is twofold. First, I'll try to stitch together as many substitutive views as possible from the global south on the universal notion of translation to explore various discursive practices, and then ushering disciplines like environmental studies, biology, ecology, geometry. I will try to liberate the discipline itself from linguistic and literary boundaries. Thereby, will try to compel you to think deeply and discursively about an alternative discourse of translation as a field of study. According to the systematic poetics of Indian practices of translational act, best explained in the preface of the pre-colonial texts written in Sanskrit and other Indian languages, there was no such spatial concept of transference of meaning like translation. Rather, a multitude of terms denoting alternative practices in peripheral spaces like anuvad, retelling, Rūpāntara, transplantation, Vivartanam, evolution, Tarjumā, paraphrase, Chāyā, shadow, Bhāṇgani, to deconstruct. These terms depict the use of the concept of translation in a variety of contexts, thus challenging the obligation of the spatial nature of translation in global north. The first one is translation as interpretation. So what I will do, I have categorized, the different terminologies under different, subheadings, and I'm trying to think about the translational act in different, conceptual, ideologies. So the first one is translation as interpretation. The practice of anuvad is basically originating from the interpretive tradition of language philosophy in India, which is basically hermeneutic in nature. We all know that the Indian knowledge system is basically constituted of shruti, that is hearing, and smriti, that is remembering. Now, if we look at the shruti tradition of India, it depends on vashya, that is speaking, and shruti, listening. And lastly, anuvad, that is retelling. Anuvad is constituted of anu, that means after, and vad, that means speaking or discourse, utterance, statement, doctrine, argument, thesis. Therefore, anuvad has been used for all kinds of reiteration, retelling, to speak after. Avadhesh Kumar Singh in 2006 has proclaimed that this term anuvad stands for the subsequent or following discourse. Therefore, the Vashya tradition and the anuvad tradition constitute basics of Indian thought, and both the traditions together, through their temporal connotation, establishes the tradition of commentary, of explanation, of exposition and interpretation, thus contribute significantly to the Shruti tradition of Indian knowledge system. The Anuvad style approach has also given the interpreter and the commentator a lot of freedom or to interpret, to comment, and therefore offers a different perspective marked by original and creative insight. Therefore, unlike the Western or the the counterpart of translation act in India, the Anuvad never faced the anxiety to maintain the original meaning. The Western concept of translation act is a spatial flow, is stereocentric in nature. On the other hand, Anuvad is a temporal act. Therefore, when the colonial lexicographers of 19th century, they equate the term translation with Anuvad in their dictionaries, they have violated and homogenized the differences. The next, terminology, Tarjumā, which is in Urdu, means interpretation. Tarjumā karna is to interpret. Tarjumā naviz is interpreter. Tarjumā hona is to be interpreted or to be translated. So we can presume that this particular Urdu term is hinting towards subjectivity of the interpreter or the reader in the meaning making process, as against the strict adherence to the original text in the Western idea of translation. Tarjuma is hinting towards a varied range of subjective analytical reading, thereby breaking the strict notion of hegemonic relationship that exists in the West. If we look at the oral tradition of India, we can infer the term Tarjuma also hint to the art of interpretation, which relies heavily on the skill of the interpreter who mediates between the speaker and the listener. He or she grabs the content which is spoken by the speaker and then transfers the content to the listener using the tools of the target language. Mostly, interpretation happens impromptu, immediately after the original is spoken. Therefore, technically, the interpreter's responsibility lies in delivering the message, often in a condensed form, but with a very judicious choice of language using his or her subjectivity, and he is involved in this Tarjuma Karna to be translated. The next one is translation as evolution. Now, before I go into these two terms, Rūpāntara and Vivartanam, let me talk about the idea of evolution. So, while formulating the definition of life in the planetary systems, a committee assembled by NASA in 1994 suggested, following Carl Sagan's idea, that life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of growth, replication, and Darwinian evolution. Now, according to this definition, living species go through metabolism and chemical transformations in an environment filled with the right ingredients like water, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur. As stated by Oparin-Haldane theory and later ratified by Miller-Urey experiment, if the fundamental inorganic molecules present on early Earth are given the right conditions, they can start interacting with each other and form organic molecules, and thereafter evolves into an organism. If we consider author, language, culture, theme, genre, authorial intention, other textual elements as organic and inorganic molecules, which by interacting with each other can form an organic text, living and sustaining in its own environment, can we then consider translation of it as an evolution and adaptation in a Darwinian sense, where a transformed species will evolve in a completely new environment, mutating with new sets of elements like translator, target language, target culture, translatorial purpose? Let us see through unearthing two specific Indian terms, namely Rūpāntara and Vivartanam, which I argue can classify translation as evolution. Taking cue from the Indian aesthetics best explained in Bharata's Natyashastra, dramaturgy, according to whom reconstruction of a well-known story is the higher form of creativity than original creation. And all these varied terms like Rūpāntara, Vivartanam, which are hinting towards the fact that translational activity in pre-colonial India were having the existential primacy as the version and rendition were enjoying the more important position than the original form. The multiple renditions of Indian Mahakavyas like Ramayana and Mahabharata in many languages and in the South and Southeast Asia are providing this perspective of Indian plurisemiotic practice of Rūpāntara and Vivartanam. Rūpāntara was constructed by combining two Sanskrit words, Rūp and Antar. The word Rūp means form and Antar means change. Therefore, Rūpāntara denotes transformation of a text and would be equivalent to words like rendition, adaptation, version. This means that the text has not undergone a word-for-word translation like in the equivalence. Rather, it has undergone a change of the form and has been given a new shape. In Monier-Williams Sanskrit to English dictionary, root word not only means form, but also it contains the meaning like ropa, the act of raising, the act of planting, the sap, the act of sowing seeds, etc. Horicharan in his Bengali to Sanskrit to Bengali dictionary, we see a comprehensive entry of the term roop, and he too has mentioned that this particular term Rūpāntara can offer a meaning to plant, to sow. Therefore, we can see that the organic metaphor of transplantation is hidden in the term Rūpāntara, and in this process of Rūpāntara, the whole text with all its characteristics and essence is made to be adapted into a different cultural environment which has different demands and can nourish the thought in a different manner. The plant, once transplanted, flourishes in another geographical condition which refers to change and new growth, as opposed to the Western idea of translational act which consists loss and decay. Therefore, the process of Rūpāntara can be located in the organic metaphor and also in the Darwinian process of evolution. And if we think about Darwinian idea, we'll see that Darwin has talked about that three things can happen to a transplanted text or a biota. He said that one is habitat tracking, the number two is extinction, and number two is genetic change. I argue that this idea of Darwinian genetic change is actually Rūpāntara proper. In this case, source text is adapted and can freely undergo necessary changes as is required in the new geographical terrain. The source text is given appropriate indigenous flavor to suit the taste of the target reader. The target text assumes a new form, shedding the older one, and is cultivated all over again according to the aesthetics of the land of the receptors. The next term, Vivartanam, which can also be understood from the Darwinian point of view of evolution or alteration. The term is a derivation of the Sanskrit word Vivarta, which according to the Vedic philosophy denotes the altered representation or condition of the ultimate reality. And this particular term, Vivartanam in Malayalam, were used in the pre-colonial time to convey the oblique and diversified idea of translational act as practiced. In accordance with the Darwinian paradigm, an organism sustains and evolves with the changing environment due to its natural selection, and Darwin's principle of the survival of the fittest is heavily based on the biological evolution, which can also be traced in this term. So therefore, keeping these two terminological explorations as a point of departure, I argue that we can focus on a new theoretical discourse of translation studies based on ecological construction in the global South, especially in the context of India. I argue that a careful reading of these two terms, Rūpāntara and Vivartanam, can offer crucial insights into the process of acculturation through exploring different layers of organic metaphors. Thereby, we can develop the concept of eco-translology as derived by Gengxian Hu in China, who has based his idea on the Chinese philosophy. Understanding this idea from the Indian context, we too can offer a substantive view on translation studies from the global South. The next one is translation. Oh, sorry. The translation as illumination. The Hindi word Chāyā, which literally means shadow, medieval India did not believe in literal translation, even though Indian writers were familiar with the concept of verbatim translation, known as the Prakrit text into the Sanskrit, that is frequently used in Sanskrit drama. Indians preferred adaptation to verbatim translation. Unlike the other terminologies, this particular concept, Chāyā, has the linkage to the Indian Puranic world. Chāyā is actually the Hindu personification of the goddess of shadow, answer, and the wife of Surya, the Hindu god, Hindu sun god. The key point here is that the prototype of Chāyā as Sadrisha, as look-alike, a woman who looked like the other and is having a kind of illuminative translational quality. If we analyze the concept from the scientific point of view, we may consider that the source text as the object on which light falls and creates shadow of the object. Now, if we consider the light as the source of interpretation, then with the change of the direction of the light on the static object text, the shadow will also change its shape and position. Therefore, we can argue that object or the source text can create multiple shadows depending on the direction of the interpretation of analysis. Light becomes visible in space in various forms and is physically perceptible in different ways. The effect of the translational work depends on the process of looking at the primary version. Therefore, Chāyā heightens the sensibility and the potential of perception of the person who is translating the text. And the last one, translation as fission. Northeastern side of India, which literally means breakdown. Now, as such, you break down a word down to such an extent where you can reach the meaning that lies hidden under the multi-layered structure of a word. It refers, therefore, to go beyond the outer frame of a word. However, it also has the connotation of breaking away from an already existing structure or convention. When a text from a regional language gets translated into a majoritarian language, a parallel stem breaks away from a steady flowing literary tradition to venture out into a larger world. It crosses over the threshold of its native literary tradition to now flow and merge into the global network of knowledge system. So the concept of break also brings in the negative connotations of crack, discord, gap, friction, difference, disruption. Does this therefore allude to the notion of translation of violence as a violence which creates a crack in the indigenous sensibility inherent in a literary translation? With the ambition of fitting in the bracket of Indian literature in translation, does literature mold itself to befit the reading of expectation of the global readership, thereby causing a disruption and a discord within the indigenous literary tradition? Since break or Bhāṇgani also might refer to the gap in time, can we then think translation from a temporal point of view? Now I will come to the conclusion. The well-known, if somewhat notorious, turns in translation studies in the global north are indicative, say for example, the cultural turn, the orthodox turn, etc. They are indicative of a field of study that is still trying to find its boundaries. In subsequent turns, translation studies has expanded. On the one hand, the ambit of its scholarly view from the linguistic to pragmatics to culture to sociology to ideology power, as Vera was talking about. But my point is that are these expanding efforts expanding the notion of translation beyond the hegemony of global north? Many of the implications of the terminological exploration still need to be explored, I do agree. But the key of the entire enterprise is to study the alternative uses of the terms of translation as practiced in the global south. By alternative, I mean alternative to the idea that is universal, that is translation perpetuated by the global north. I will end my presentation with a quotation from Pablo Neruda. Give me silence, give me water, give me hope, give me struggle, iron volcanoes. The theoretical work I did opened a few aspects of understanding the translational activities in Global South. I feel that the need of the hour is to find suitable answers to these questions, to venture into the field of alternative practices, which are till date the least expanded and explored area in the Global South. Thank you.
Supposed to end at 12:30. Okay, so that means we have 18 minutes for questions, comments. The crisper they are, the better, so that we get more in. And if they are not, you know what? We just go with it. Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for this splendid panel, the great presentations. I might have questions and provocations for you concerning like the overall topics that you introduced. First of all, the idea of translation and all the losses in translation that we miss through what you said. First, the idea of translation as conquest. This is something that Rindon mentioned, also speaks directly to my own work. The connections between European colonialism in Asia and South America, and the idea that translation was a basic requirement for not only bringing possibilities of communication, but building a ground through which a colonialism would be settled in these places. Even though, as Rindon mentioned, some Indian languages didn't understand translation as cognition, which is probably one of the characteristics of this sort of European modernity. Now, I would like if you could do some comments on this, and also Monica, on if you see conflict between the idea of semi-periphery and South, actually considering South as an intellectual project instead of a geography of epistemic inequality only, where semi-periphery could also sit together with South for promoting what you would like to have a place for critical addressing, critical engagements with how we position in academia, globally speaking. Thank you so much.
Yep. Yeah, thank you also from my side for this really fantastic panel. I have two questions. I guess that the first question actually was addressed both by Vera Elisabeth and also by Rindon. And perhaps you could, I wonder if you could react to this. I know that this is a sort of difficult topic for translation studies, but I'd like to, especially thinking in asymmetry, in diffusion and production of knowledge, what could be the role of translation machines such as DeepL and Google Translator and so on? So, and especially in case of Rindon, how could this actually bring some trouble to your model to actually use evolution theory to actually explain translation processes? Because in that way, using machines, you don't have at least the traditional way of evolution. You have a combination also of big data, machines, and also humans, and not only biological process in the process of evolution. How this actually could create some difficulties for your, I don't know if it's you use evolution, Darwinian evolution theory as a sort of metaphor, or really as a sort of theory for explaining translation in evolution by translation. And in that sense, how actually machines complicated your scheme. And to Monica, it's in the same vein as Claudio, is the idea of semi-periphery. I know this is very much used, especially in the context of, starting with Wallerstein and the whole world system theory and so on. But my specific question is how the emergence of China creates some difficulties for this. What is exactly China? Is semi-periphery, is center? So therefore, if you insist in using geographical metaphors, perhaps you should talk about multi-centered or multipolar globalization and not really center, periphery, semi-periphery. And the question would be if it's not perhaps more useful to use not geography, but much more relational concepts in which you see webs of power as a relational, so to say, construct, and not really a geographic or physical construct.
Any other hands up? Okay, so please, Rindon.
Okay, so I'll start with answer to Claudio. So first of all, if we look at the trajectory of the translation studies as written by Susan Bassnett and etc., you will see that she too, though she has worked with Harish Trivedi, as Vera has pointed out, at the very end of that particular book, which was published in 1982, she has referred just sketchily 3-4 scholars like Sujit Mukherjee, Harish Trivedi, and P. Lal. Now, the point that I'm trying to say that if we look at the syllabus of translation studies in Europe, as far as I know, and in India also, you will see that translation studies has these Western theories like equivalence, scopus, polysystem. They have never been termed as Western translation theory, as translation theory. Now, after that portion in the syllabus, you will have in Indian universities Indian notion of translation. And my point is that why we are not tagging that Western concept of translation, then you say that Indian notion of translation. Number one. Number two, these term translation, unfortunately, all these great scholars, they have never thought of exploring the etymology of the word. The first person, you will be surprised to know, Talal Asad, the famous post-colonial thinker, he's the first person who has, went into the etymology and found that the word translation in 14th century didn't have this meaning called meaning transfer. It was meant for transporting a saint's body or a sacred body of a saint from one place to the other. And there he has connected the spatial transference. You can read this essay. Unfortunately, I couldn't remember the name of the essay by Talal Asad, but I can tell you the book. The edited book name is Between Language and Culture, edited by Anuradha Dingwane and Carol Mayer. In that particular book, Talal Asad has written a chapter on this. My point is that the idea of translation is extremely terracentric from its beginning, very spatial, and it directly connects with the colonization process. During my MPhil thesis, have looked at 19 dictionaries from Sanskrit to Bengali, Sanskrit to Hindi, etc., and saw that the colonial politics of meaning making has actually equated translation, which is a spatial metaphor, and anuvad, which is temporal in nature. So if you ask any Bengali, what is the Bengali word for translation, they will say anuvad. Without knowing the thing, the translation is spatial, anuvad is temporal. We didn't have this space concept. Another thing that I couldn't do it in this paper, I'm also working, and this refers to you. I'm really thankful. I will come to the machine part later. But this particular question that you have said about metaphor, I have been asked this in every conference, that whether I'm using hard science or I'm using translation as metaphor. Now, I myself am not very sure, but I am trying to create alternative mathematical models to translation. I'm using geometry, Euclidean geometry, to understand translation, as well as Darwinian and neo-Darwinian idea of evolution to understand Indian translation terminologies, and trying to create one mathematical view for the translation, which was not there, and the ecological point of view of Indian translation terminologies, which was also not there. And lastly, this machine translation, yes, I'm aware of that. But the problem is that you have rightly, you have understood. The moment I will take machine translation in this, it will disrupt my entire thesis, because then I'm not very sure how to use evolution in the machine translation. I'm not very, I do not have that knowledge in machine translation. So I will definitely look at it, but right now I do not have any answer the how to tackle that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for your question. So, first of all, I would like not to speak about loss in translation, but in gain and enrichment of translation. And I think it was obvious in this translation process in Rosario Ferré also, because it's a gaining process. So that's very important. But at the same time, this power relations between language and historic asymmetries is also a very important point. We talked yesterday about the role of the translators in colonial situations, and I mentioned the Malinche, for example. So she really was like reinforcing with her translations the colonization of Mexico. So it's also very, very, so it can reinforce and support asymmetries also. And then for the question for the machine translation, we had someone talking to us in our summer school and our Master of Translation Studies, who is really a linguist and also expert in computational things. So and he presented us that it's yet so DeepL is really a very, very brilliant machine yet. It's a little it's made in Cologne, and it's based on a database with certain kind of text, and that's always very, very important. Which is the database, which is down there? If it's in scientific database and so on. So this contribution in our summer school showed that there's a very, very great evolution in machine translation processes, but he showed us that machine translation functions very, very well when so long as language use is like very simple and repeating. So the best book he looked for to be translated by machine translation would be Harry Potter, because there are structures that are always repeating, and the machines are learning. So Proust was very difficult to translate. so that's perhaps a problem we can see with this global English also. So we can use global English, but perhaps with a loss of complexity. So I'm a big example because my English is not very, so I better speak in with complex phrases. And so this could be perhaps a problem, so the loss of complexity, but there's a big evolution in it for sure.
Yes, Monica-Elena.
Or global Englishes, because there are more than one, right? I think every English is kind of in a way correct, if we want to speak incorrect and not correct. Yeah, thank you for the question. So regarding the geography part, of course, that's why I use semi-peripheral and not semi-southern, semi-northern, because although geography influences science, because it makes a difference if I study in Mumbai or if I study in Göttingen. I had I mean, we don't have the time to elaborate on that, but geography sometimes also makes makes a difference, but I prefer to use center or periphery because that makes it more clear what we talk about, right? So at the center, the part of the center, of course, we talk about also China in the next future, right? It will become part of the center. So I think coming to the question with China, I think it's a matter of power and economic power. Every language develops because of economic power as well. So where we have power, where we have economic dominance, we have a very big extension on knowledge production, on language. So that influences a lot. And that's why I think that will become part of the center, right? So we always have to deal with these ideologies. We always have to deal with these big influences on language. So that is always part of that when we think about how languages or how knowledge production will be part of the center or part of the periphery. And now, Claudio, to come to this part of southern and semi-peripheral and peripheral, or southern and what is like in between, the complexity of being in between, I think it's talking about it. I think it's, I have to come back to stories because I think stories are underestimated. I think the way we produce knowledge has to do with how we handle what are our mindsets, and these have to be told, the empowerment between groups in order to talk, what are your challenges, what are my challenges? So in order to talk about that, I think that's something that has to be part of the scientific discourse, because that's what makes us do what we do here, right? But of course, that's I think that even our science community has not come that far to acknowledge this part, this very important part of storying. And I thank you, ethnologists and anthropologists, that you bring this forward, because this is something that is really lacking in linguistics, right? So linguistics is very cognitive oriented still, unfortunately. So that's why we have to move beyond this barrier, and we have, if we want to have a more realistic picture of knowledge production. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we can round up now. Okay, that would be the last question. So we'll leave at 12:30.
Last question. Yes. Thank you. It's more a comment maybe than a question to Rindon. Thank you so much for this rich panorama of concepts and metaphors of translation in India. Now, maybe it's a side story to your presentation, but I realized that the Urdu term for translation you mentioned, Tarjumā, is the same as the Turkish term for translation, tercüme, which leads me to believe that probably the root of the term is either in Arabic or in Persian, which then you will have realized that I'd like to provoke, but which then leads me to question the Indianness of the concept on the one hand, and to bring in a completely different story of conquest and territorial conquest and linguistic domination on the other hand.
Yeah, I do agree. This term actually came from Arabic. And recently, I also didn't know, Professor Same Hanna, he told that, this particular term, Tarjumā, in Arabic, it does mean biography. So there is a huge change from biography to interpretation.
Well, please join me in thanking our panelists for a great panel. Thank you all very much. And thanks to all of you for being such good sport by not insisting on me recognizing more hands. Thank you.